In this video, we're going to take a very quick look at the various learning theories that have been developed by educationalists over the years. As cybersecurity professionals, we may be called on to train people working in the organization. We all know that humans are the first line of defense and perhaps the weakest component of any security system. And so it can be important to train people in cybersecurity concepts to give them an understanding of the risks and the threats out there. And so we may have some training to do. Data protection officers also have to communicate with employees in the company and explain to them the risks and the obligations that the GDPR places on them. So over the years, theorists, psychologists, educationalists have come up with three main ways of thinking about how people learn. And we're going to look at those three main ways. So there are three main traditions in learning theory. There is behaviorism, cognitivism, and constructivism. And we're going to look at each of these three ideas, each of these three approaches in turn. So the first of these is behaviorism, and this is perhaps the oldest of the approaches and perhaps even the most famous. And there were four main practitioners of behaviorism. There is Pavlov, who is one of the more famous, Thorndike, Watson, and also Skinner. So Pavlov was a physiologist from Russia, and he was like a medical doctor, and he received a Nobel Prize in 1904. But he became more famous for what we now know as conditioning. And so he had a very famous experiment with some dogs. And he saw that when a dog sees food, it salivates. And this is an unconditional response. The dog just does this naturally. It's part of the dog's physiology. And this observation presumably came out of his research on the digestive system. And the food we would call an unconditioned stimulus, and the salivation is an unconditioned response. So the dog sees this and it just happens. So he's famous for this experiment with dogs. And what Pavlov did was he discovered that consistently pairing the ringing of a bell with the presentation of the food, that the dog came to associate the sound with the food. And so in this case, the noise, the sound, was a conditioned stimulus, and the salivation was a conditioned response. So we started with the dog and the food. When the dog sees the food, the dog salivates. Fair enough. That's a natural occurrence, an unconditioned response. Then there's a neutral stimulus presented to the dog. So this is some sound or some bell, a ringing noise, whatever. And this solicited no response from the dog. However, further in the experiment, the food and the sound were presented together. And so obviously when the dog saw the food and we had salivation, fair enough. But with time, the dog learned to associate the sound with the food. And so when the dog was presented with only the sound, there was also salivation there. So we were able to train the dog to salivate when he heard the sound. And so this is Pavlov's most famous experiment. We often hear talk of Pavlov's dogs, and sometimes even it's used in a political context. But this is what he's most famous for. Now, this is a kind of learning. It's an objectively observable change in behaviour in response to a particular stimulus. And that's fitting with behaviourism, really. It's very much focused on changes that can be observed and changes in behaviour. It was Watson that coined the term behaviourism, and he was a big believer in nurture over nature as the determinant of how people turn out. And he's quoted as having said, "Give me a dozen healthy infants, well-formed, and my own specified world to bring them up in, and I'll guarantee to take any one at random and train him to become any type of specialist I might select. Doctor, lawyer, artist, merchant chief, and even a beggarman and thief." And he's famous, or perhaps infamous, for an experiment where he conditioned a little boy to be afraid of a white rat. So in the beginning, the boy had no fear of rats, and he trained him to be afraid. So this kind of learning is all about giving the correct response to a stimulus. And that's a very narrow view of learning, I think. But it does, it does have a role, and it does work for some things. I mean, if you look at these sentences here, we can automatically finish out the sentence just because we've been conditioned in that way. It's also useful for certain things like drills or using flashcards. There is a role for this kind of learning for particular types of things. It's arguable, for example, that when we hear 7 times 7 and our brain goes 49, that's a conditioned response. Like, we're not thinking about that. We're not visualizing a 7 by 7 grid and mentally counting up the squares. It's a learned response. Next up, we have Thorndike, and he too experimented on animals, but eventually moved on to humans. He's best known for experiments with puzzle boxes. So hungry cats were placed in boxes where only certain actions would set them free. And he formulated some various theories then based on that. He said, that we can learn by trial and error. We learn by reward and punishment. And we learn through repetition. It's easy to see how some perhaps early 20th century educational philosophy in Ireland might have been informed by this reward and punishment type view of learning. The most famous then of the behaviourists was Skinner, and he was a psychologist. Initially he wanted to be a writer of fiction, but he abandoned literature and took up psychology and was successful at that, and was a professor at Harvard. His work laid the foundation then for programmed learning. And like the other behaviourists, he was very concerned with producing the right response to a particular stimulus. He felt that education wasn't scientific enough, and he felt that through his experiments he could improve the way children were taught. He said, "The advances which have already been made in our control of the learning process suggest a thorough revision of classroom practices, and fortunately they tell us how revision can be brought about. This is not, of course, the first time the results of experimental science have been brought to bear upon the practical problems of education. The modern classroom does not, however, offer much evidence that research in the field of learning has been respected or used." It's said that he visited his daughter's classroom and wasn't a bit happy with how unscientific the whole education process was. Skinner did a lot of work with rats and training rats to perform particular actions through either reward or punishment with positive and negative feedback. And we can take a look at some of that.
He approaches the food device, stands up near the bar, presses it, but since he does not see the pellet and the food cup, he is not rewarded. Now he finds the pellet and is rewarded for approaching the food cup. From now on, he confines more of his activity to the region of the food dish. At last he hits the bar and gets an immediate reward. Has he learned? Will it take him as long to press the bar the next time? Although the animal still makes quite a few irrelevant responses, he presses the bar much sooner the second time. The occurrence of a single reward has strengthened the tendency to make the response of pressing the bar. Notice that the rat performs exactly the same response which was rewarded. The behavior of the animal has been radically changed by this training. This animal has learned to bite a rubber tube as soon as the shock goes on. When he starts biting, the experimenter turns off the shock. Motivation and reward are crucial factors in learning. A motivated animal will learn any response which occurs and is promptly followed by a reduction in the strength of the drive. In this way, motivation and reward control learning.
So Skinner and the other behaviourists were very big on reinforcement and punishment, positive feedback and negative feedback. So reinforcement is a consequence that causes to a behaviour to occur with greater frequency. So, a pleasant consequence, some sort of reward can cause the behaviour, or you can punish the behaviours you want to occur less frequently. So behaviourism then had a big emphasis on producing observable and measurable outcomes in students. You could have like a pre-assessment of the students to determine where the instruction should begin, and then they're trained and you can bring them to the next level and you can go level by level. There was a big emphasis on mastering the early steps before progressing to the more complex ones, and you used reinforcement, either positive or negative, to impact the performance. So what can behaviourism be useful for? It's an interesting quote here. Behaviourists attempt to prescribe strategies that are most useful for building and strengthening stimulus-response associations. including the use of instructional cues, practice, and reinforcement. These prescriptions have generally proven reliable and effective in facilitating learning that involves discriminations, recalling facts, generalizations, defining and illustrating concepts, associations, applying explanations, and chaining, or automatically performing a specified procedure. It certainly has a role. It's also perhaps very much of its time. If you consider an economy where people were working in factories, working in production lines, and lots of humans had the main task of pulling lever A in response to stimulus B, you can see how providing cannon fodder for factories was, made this kind of learning appropriate and this kind of theory a reasonable one. And behaviourism does work for certain kinds of learning. I gave the example earlier of, 7 times 7, boom, 49. No thinking there. It's just a response that has been programmed into us. It's tempting, of course, to speculate how we might use this as cybersecurity professionals and training people. It would be lovely if you could send an electric shock to people's chairs every time they opened a phishing email, but of course that's not possible. HR would probably have something to say about that. We do see behaviourism in evidence in game design and app design. Interaction designers reward users with, beeps and flashing lights and nice sounds to make games and to make apps more addictive. There's a lot of behaviourism at work in, say, the design of slot machines, or the pokies, as Australians would call them. Slot machine designers are experts in behaviourism and giving people that reward, for performing a particular task. So we do see behaviourism still at work. It does have a role, a real and genuine role. It also has a role perhaps in a negative way, where it is actually being used to make things more addictive. So in summary then, behaviourism is all about real, observable and measurable behaviours. It's all about the stimulus and response and giving the correct response to the stimulus. So what's the capital of France? Paris. That's the correct response. And learning is all about giving the correct response to a particular stimulus. I think we could agree that's probably a fairly narrow understanding of learning. The next learning theory we're going to look at then is cognitivism. Cognitivism is rooted in the study of memory and the brain, and it's based on experiments involving memory. And cognitivism focuses on getting information stored in the brain. So the brain is this memory device, and our job is to get information in there where it can be remembered. So cognitive information processing then looks at how information in the world comes to be stored in our long-term memory. So there's information from our senses, information in the world. We hear something, we see something. And this gets stored in our sensory store for a very short time. And it will get transferred to our working memory, depending then on various things, including how much attention we're paying and whether we recognize it as a pattern, whether we recognize it as something we know. And then it can stay in the short-term memory for maybe 20 seconds or so. And our short-term memory has a fairly limited capacity. They say short-term memory can store, 7 plus or minus 2 chunks of information. And then the goal when we're trying to get someone to learn something is to transfer something from short-term memory to long-term memory so it's not lost. And there are various factors that can affect the transfer to long-term memory. And psychologists and educationalists have performed all sorts of experiments to come up with all sorts of quantitative values and qualitative approaches to maximizing how much information gets stored in long-term memory. So Sterling did experiments with the visual system to see how long information was actually stored. And it seems that the visual system can store lots of information, but it decays very, very quickly. He found that the auditory system can hold information a bit longer than the visual system. And attention is crucial. So if you can get people paying attention, get them to, expect something that's interesting or useful, that can really, really help. Selective attention then is the learner's ability to select and process certain information while simultaneously ignoring other information. So we may have our senses being bombarded with lots of information and we can filter out what's useful and what's not. This can depend on the meaning that the information holds for the learner, the similarity between competing information, the complexity or unfamiliarity of the information, and it can also depend on individual differences then, age, whether someone's a bit hyperactive or not, various different factors. And the key thing about cognitivism is that all of this information and all of these suggestions are based on data that came out of many, many experiments on memory. Some things we can do to get the learner's attention have come out of these experiments. So we can make the material meaningful to the learner. So we could link the content to the responsibility of the learner in the workplace, for example. So you could say, this is important to you because you're going to be doing this in your job. So, the GDPR is important because you're going to need to pay attention to it in your role. This information about how to spot phishing email is important because someone is going to be trying to get you in your role in your workplace to try and click on this so they can get access to the network. So various things like that. You can employ standard cues to start the learning. You can focus learner attention on particular bits of information. So there may be lots of information, but you could get them to focus on particular things they might find interesting. You can get learning materials to include, multimedia, pictures and graphics. Typographical clues can be important as well. An important element to getting people's attention is to remove the unnecessary distractions, so irrelevant details. That can be useful. It can help to break down complex information and to relate it to prior knowledge so that people can connect it to stuff they already know. You can have assessments and tasks that can focus on particular information, and you can even have games and activities and things like that. Pattern recognition is a very important element of getting information from sensory memory into the working memory. And where we see something, we might recognize it as a form of something we've seen before. So if you consider all the variations of this letter A here, when we see these black marks inside in that oval there, we can interpret that as a kind of the letter A. Like when we look at it, we see a letter A because it fits the pattern of something we've already seen before. So, past learning and prior learning can be very important to how we understand things. A good illustration of this is the Stroop effect. It's very difficult to actually read out these words because when we go to read red, the fact that it's blue is prior knowledge. And so it can actually be very difficult to say red, blue, green and purple because the colours are prior learning that is interfering with that. We also see the same when we're proofreading documents. If we've written the document, we have a lot of prior knowledge of what's already in it. And so we have a tendency to see what we think it says, not what we actually typed. That's why it can be very hard to proofread your own work. There's that prior knowledge there that's interfering with what's going on right now. So Miller suggested that working memory has space for about 7 plus or minus 2 chunks of information. So he did these experiments where he showed people numbers and asked them to repeat immediately what they'd seen. And the chunk can vary in size, and it depends what it is being remembered. But he did all these experiments and came up with this number 7 plus or minus 2, which is sometimes why when people talk about presentations, they say you should have 7 plus or minus 2 points on your slide. And that's maybe a bit of a leap, but that's where that comes from. So if we take this sequence of letters, for example, J, F, K, F, B, I, M, T, U, N, A, S, A, M, I, T, to remember that is very, very difficult. It exceeds the working memory. There's just too many letters there to remember. But actually, if we break this up into JFK, FBI, MTU, NASA, MIT, that can actually be remembered. Because that's only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 chunks of information. So depending on what the information is, it can be more easily remembered or not. There's even a link to working memory capacity and the categories of chunks. So they found that, you could remember 7 digits, but 6 letters and 5 short words and things like that. Lots and lots of experiments. And, cognitivism is very focused on this idea of the brain as a memory machine that works in a certain way and it's only got a certain capacity, So Peterson and Peterson did an experiment where they presented subjects with 3 letters, or trigrams they were called. And then they were asked to count backwards in 3s from a random number during these intervals. So the combinations of letters they gave them had no vowels, so they couldn't make any words. It was just consonants. And they made them count backwards so they couldn't rehearse the sequences of letters in their heads, And they found then that there was a big increase in forgetting as time increased, So as time goes by, you can forget things out of your short-term memory fairly quickly. So the standard way to keep something in short-term memory is rehearsal. So if you're trying to remember a phone number, which is a task most people don't even attempt anymore, I think, but if you're trying to remember a phone number, you can keep repeating it over and over again till you manage to get to a pen and a pad, or until you manage to get to a phone and actually dial the number. And this repetition is a way to keep things in working memory. It turned out even with this, there's a serial position effect, it's called, and so the first and last items tend to be remembered the best. Again, this often translates into advice when giving instruction or giving presentations. The first few slides and the last few slides are probably the ones that are going to have the most impact. And rehearsal or learning by rote does actually work for simple stuff. So like learning off your times tables. That's something lots of us did as kids. I'm sure our parents thought that, rote learning was inappropriate and mindless, but really for some things it's the way to go. Learning off your times tables is the way to do it. You don't want to be thinking, what 6 times 7 is. You just have that learned off. Same for verb tables, je suis, tu es, il est, elle est, nous sommes, vous êtes, ils sont, elles sont. Like, just learn it off. Repetition, repetition, repetition. And that can be a good way then to transfer things to long-term memory. Now, it's not so good for more complex information. Interestingly, people who teach programming often see students trying to learn off computer programs in the hope that they might come up in the exam. But anyone who's learned to program knows that that's folly, that you can't learn off computer programs. You have to understand at a more complex level what's going on. But through education, some people believe that all learning, all education is learning stuff off. But as we know, there are more complex kinds of knowledge and more complex kinds of learning. So how can then we manage short-term memory? Well, extra demands on the scarce resources of working memory can be reduced. So one thing you can do is you can keep certain information critical to understanding available at all times during the course. So in a chemistry book, for example, you'll find that, the periodic table is on the front cover. That's something, or inside the front cover. That's something that, needs to be handy and available at all times. You can have like glossaries of terms or learning objectives, topic maps, things like that too. Using graphics instead of words can help not overload the short-term memory. But when organising information, you don't want to have a massively complex hierarchical structure either. That can just lose people. But chunking up content is essential. So breaking it up into little chunks that can be remembered is key. So long-term memory then is where all of this knowledge, all this learning is stored. And so long-term memory is a permanent store where information resides, often in a dormant state, unused, not thought about, until it's called back into consciousness. And so this storehouse of information, they're encoded from the short-term memory. Often when people talk about the transfer of memory or the transfer of information from short-term to long-term memory, they produce a diagram that would remind a communications technician of the process of, encoding information in a modem to be in a channel and then decoding it later. A lot, I think, of the rhetoric surrounding cognitivism sees the mind as a memory machine, and through experimentation we can figure out how it works and then use that. And there's something to that, but I do think it can be taken a bit far. It's believed that once something is in long-term memory, it's never lost, it's there forever. And it's also believed that long-term memory has limitless capacity, unlike the short-term memory. There are some things we can do to help the encoding process. So we can organize information. We can provide learners with, outlines, hierarchies, concept maps and things like that. And mnemonics can be useful. We have Richard of York gave battle in vain. So that can then help us with red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. We can link unknown information to known information. You can even have a narrative, a story. There's a very famous parlour trick where, if you present someone with a list of household items, maybe 15 of them, it can be impossible to remember them. But if a person weaves those items into a story, well, they can remember the story and, pick off the items in the story as they go along. So a narrative can be a great way to do that. So forgetting then is a problem. How do we forget things? What causes us to forget things? Well, the first kind of forgetting isn't forgetting at all. It's where learners can fool themselves into with shallow encoding and think that they have actually learned something when they haven't. So it's a failure to encode in the first place. A failure to retrieve that can be caused by encoding specificity. So there may have been other things going on when that was being encoded and stored in the long-term memory. And without those, it's not easy to retrieve them, So things like that can be a factor. There can also be interference with memory. So there's retroactive interference and proactive interference. So retroactive interference is when stuff that's learned later interferes with the knowledge that has already been learned and prevents it from being recalled. But often it can even be proactive, where earlier learning interferes with the new learning. It's often said that it's harder to unlearn something that you've learned than it is to learn something new. So these are factors that can affect memory and that can cause forgetting. Now, cognitivism recognizes individual differences and tries to accommodate them. And it acknowledges that there are different learning styles, and learners, perceive and interact in a different way. One of the theorists was Kolb, and he came up with this learning style inventory. And he had sort of two indexes, the perceiving axis and the processing axis. So on one axis you have like concrete experience versus reflective observation, and then another axis you had abstract conceptualization versus active experimentation. And that these were different facets of learning. We also have this idea of different kinds of learners. So we have visual learners who learn through seeing. We have auditory learners who learn through listening. And we have tactile learners who learn through moving and doing and touching. And so this idea that different people have different preferences and are different kinds of learners, this is a big deal in cognitivism, and is a bit of a move away from behaviourism, where, everybody was the same, and if you just gave them the right electric shocks in the right places, they'd all behave the way they're supposed to behave. So cognitivism then is based on how the brain processes information. It's all to do with perception and memory and getting things into memory. And it acknowledges individual difference as well. So it considers learning to be the integration or organization into the long-term memory of the learner. So there's information and knowledge in the world. It comes to us into our short-term memory, and then we have to put it into our long-term memory. And the mind is this device that can hold information, and the objective in training and the objective in education is to make sure stuff gets in there into that long-term memory. Cognitivism is, of course, still very much relevant today, and it has an important role to play in the kinds of things that can be learned off. And much of education, much of knowledge is based on remembering stuff. It's all very well to say there are, higher kinds of learning and understanding, but at the basis is basic knowledge, basic facts, basic things that must be remembered and must be learned. But increasingly modern work does require more than just being able to recall information. And so this is where other learning theories come into play. So the next learning theory we want to consider is constructivism. And this is then a very different view of what learning is and what education is. So constructivists believe that learners construct their own understanding. They construct their own knowledge. They construct their own meaning. So learners are not empty vessels waiting to be filled. The job of the trainer or the educator isn't to take knowledge from his or her mind and to implant it in the other person's mind. Constructivists believe that education is about helping people form their own understanding of the world. Piaget was one of these constructivists, and there's a very famous film clip of him talking to a child, Julia, about, how things work. And he asks her what makes the wind. And she says, the trees. And he said, how do you know? And she says, well, I saw them waving their arms. On a windy day, the trees were waving their arms, and that made the wind. And in this exchange here, the child has constructed her own understanding of how the world works. Interestingly, Piaget and others and other constructivists were not terribly concerned by the fact that Julia was wrong. The trees don't make the wind. But what they were interested in was how learners construct their own understanding of the world around them. So there are two forms of constructivism. There's individual constructivism, or first wave constructivism. So Piaget and his followers took things quite far. They weren't interested in the true representation of the world. They were more interested in individual meaning making. And radical constructivists believed there was no truth out there as such. Now, obviously, as educators, as people trying to train people, we kind of have a problem with that. There is actually a wrong answer, from time to time. And it's wonderful that people can construct their own meaning. But, some things are right and some things are wrong as well. Social constructivism then, sometimes called second wave constructivism, emphasized more the social context of learning and the ways in which learners work together to construct knowledge, so that people working together as a society or as a community of practice, or as a, even a medieval guild, could construct understanding and knowledge. And so one is more individual, and the second wave then is more social. So constructivists believe then that the educator's job is to provide learners with opportunities to build their own understanding. So the educator's job is to create learning experiences and environments where people can construct their own meaning. And so there are a number of approaches then that can be used to teach in a constructivist way. So one thing we can do is we can embed learning in complex, realistic and relevant learning environments. We can provide for social negotiation and shared responsibility as part of learning. We can support multiple perspectives and multiple representations of content. And also we can nurture self-awareness of the knowledge construction process. So help learners to understand how they're learning. Then we can encourage ownership of learning as well. So this all sounds wonderful, of course, but it can be very hard work. And as we've seen, there are pitfalls. People need guidance. They sometimes need to be told, well, actually, that's a great theory you have, but no, the trees don't make the wind. In fact, it's the other way around. Vygotsky was a key contributor to the constructivist approach, but he focused on the social aspects of learning and how people learn through social interaction and through negotiation. And he pointed out that collaboration enables new insights and solutions to arise. Can also, challenge our egocentric view of things in a way that, say, something like reading can't. And so this is a very different form then of learning than the simply transmission of knowledge. Like, I know something, I'm going to tell you, then you know it now. It's different to that. And we see a lot of this kind of approach now in e-learning, actually. It informs a lot of good e-learning. So constructivist approaches to learning then often rely on problem-based learning. So in universities around the world, we see more and more of this. We see people working in groups on real-world complex problems and trying to figure out solutions together. And that's a form of learning. And there's also now the approach of a cognitive apprenticeship. So in many societies, particularly in Europe, we've had an approach where there's sort of academic learning and academic careers, and then things like trades, how to be a plumber, a carpenter, a mechanic. And in those trades, there's a very well developed and well understood an apprenticeship model where you enter this community not really knowing anything, and you work and do real work alongside people who are experts, and you learn and are trained that way. Now, obviously, there's quite a lot of formal learning takes place in that context too, but it's very much a community approach, and learning is becoming a competent member of that community of professionals. And we're seeing that approach now come into higher education a bit as well. We see that approach to learning and that approach to training, that approach to education actually has a lot to offer. So in summary then, the constructivist view of learning sees learners as active beings out in the world, not empty vessels that just need to be filled with knowledge. They're not, as the behaviorists might think, people that need to be trained to respond in the correct way. The cognitivists might think that they are memory machines that need to be optimized. They are people out in the world, out in a community, and they construct their own understanding of the world based on their experiences. Constructivists believe that learning is, dynamic, out in the world and social, and that it's the job of educators then to provide authentic and realistic experiences that learners can use to construct their understanding. It's arguable too that constructivism is a response to changes in the economy, where people are no longer working in factories, pulling the right buttons and pressing the correct, knobs, and that knowledge and understanding isn't just about remembering things and remembering facts and remembering how to do things. That a deeper kind of understanding of the world and of how things work is what's required now for the modern economy. So it could be argued that each of the different approaches to learning is very much of its time. But in reality, each does have something to offer, and different kinds of knowledge and different kinds of learning can be brought on using the appropriate techniques. So they do have, each of them, something to offer.